Welcome to a talk where nobody talks about nothing to nobody. It's probably a good way of describing this as anything. There's no self. There is no self. That's the heart of what we are here to talk about. There may seem to be a self, there may very, very much seem to be a self, but I am here to sit in this chair and assert over and over again that there is no self. And insofar as words like awakening or liberation, or even worse, that weasel word enlightenment, insofar as they have any meaning at all, and we can argue about whether they do have any meaning at all, but if they do, insofar as they do, I'm going to sit here and assert that the only sense we can make of those words is that they suggest in some way the possibility of the direct seeing that there is no self. So, you know, we're not talking about philosophizing the self out of existence, even though I would assert it's actually very easy to do that. You know, it's very easy to logify, sorry about the made-up word, or philosophize the self out of existence. And plenty of philosophers do that. And in a way, so what? You know, I sit down with myself and I pick up a book argufying the self out of existence, and it's utterly convincing maybe, and the logic is absolutely irrefutable, and I put it down and I'm still a self. I'm just a self that's read a book that's explained to me that I don't exist, but I still feel like I exist. So what we're talking about here really has nothing to do with, it has nothing to do with ideas around this actually at all, although obviously we will exchange ideas this afternoon in a way it's all we can do. You know, but what I'm here to talk about and to suggest is that so we can philosophize, we can talk about it, we can intellectualize about it, but ultimately none of that has any bearing. What can happen, I am here to suggest, is that there can simply be the direct seeing that there is no self, and when that is directly seen, it's irrefutable, and it doesn't matter what the mind says about it. And in fact, even if the absence of the self is directly seen, the mind might go into revolt against that, the mind might argue against that in all sorts of ways, but it's still irrefutably seen, because what sees this is not the mind itself. It's one of the things that makes this so terribly difficult to talk about, you know, because I'm talking, you will talk later, hopefully, we exchange words which can only really express ideas, and the seeing through the self is not an idea. It's not something that can be described in words, but in a sense, when the self is seen through, then it's all over. There is nothing really more to do or say. And when I say it's all over, you could be very well entitled to ask, but what do you mean by it? Your life, my life. You know, when this is seen, then my life is over and your life is over. Now, life may go on if seeing non-duality does not happen to coincide with physical death. Then life will go on, but it will no longer be your life. It is no longer my life. It's just stuff happening. And there's a few things in that simple sentence, it's just stuff happening, 4 words. There's a few things in that simple sentence, maybe to pick out there. Stuff happening is in a way all that there is. I've asserted that there is no self. I am insisting that there is no self. So what is there? And what actually is there? Well, what there actually is just whatever's happening. whatever is arising. There's the sound of a voice. Maybe there's some ideas about the words being said. There's the colour of a jumper. There's the folding of a hand upon a wrist. There's crossed arms with a watch on it. There is only what is arising. There isn't anything else. What does existence consist of? Existence consists simply of what is happening. And I want to add the phrase, because it's the natural phrase to add right now. But that phrase is somewhat misleading because there is no now. There is simply what is happening. And in one sense, to say that can be heard as very challenging. There is this. What I'm asserting is this is the whole of existence, and that can be heard as very challenging. But in another way, I want to suggest to you that it lies in the realm of the absolutely obvious. It lies in the realm of the absolutely obvious, and in a way, even the mind can get hold of that, although that is not the same as the direct seeing of it. But in a way, it is absolutely obvious that whatever existence consists of, it can only consist of what is arising. I'm going to use that phrase right now in this. Whatever phenomena are present, let's say, or whatever phenomena are arising in presence. So if there is an abstract philosophy about the existence or non-existence of the self, that can only be arising as a thought in this. There's nowhere else for it to arise because there is only this. If there's a memory of a holiday that I took 5 years ago, or an expectation about a place I might visit in a month's time, that too can only arise in this. A month's time does not exist. 5 years ago does not exist. What exists is this, just this. Not a second ago. Not a second in the future, not an hour ago, even though there may be a memory in here that there was an hour ago and this was sitting in a cafe drinking coffee. That can only arise in this. This absolute focus, if you like, on this arises rather naturally when this is seen, when oneness is seen. So there is no self. There is just this, and that can be directly seen. And when it is directly seen, well, when it is directly seen, what? Well, in a way, it's a bit dangerous to talk about this because absolutely anything can happen. But I will sit here and talk about some tendencies, or at least one tendency. And one of the tendencies that I'll talk about is that when this is seen, when the self collapses, then life tends to become simpler. The kind of life that is lived tends to become simpler. We might ask ourselves why that is. And we could come up with a few answers for that, but one of the core answers for that, I would say, is that when the self is seen through, then what tends to collapse is the stories that the self tells itself about what life is about. We, and I'm using that generally, this may not apply to you as an individual, but if it doesn't, then you're quite an unusual individual. Right? Most individuals, most people, we tell stories about what life is about. We want this to be about something, whatever that might be. We want some sort of story which makes sense of this. You know, a lot of us go for a religious story. This is about something which is moving towards a future which has some sort of religious significance, or perhaps almost as popular, or maybe even more popular now, spiritual significance. In other words, we like to feel perhaps that we are going somewhere, that we're moving towards something. whatever that might be. We might have a psychological story that, you know, I'm here on this planet in order to become psychologically whole, in order to deal with my issues about my parents or what it might be. Or to be a good person in some way. Perhaps I'm here to contribute to saving the planet ecologically, and that makes me a good person, it makes me a moral person, so I can feel good about myself. Or perhaps I'm here to usher in the coming age of enlightenment or something like that. You know, we love to have a story. One of the, I don't know whether it's a curse or a blessing, so let's say it's probably both, but both the curse and blessing of the person collapsing and seeing that there is just this, well, in a sense, it should be pretty obvious. If there is just this, and there is just this, when that is seen, then all of those stories have to collapse. And I don't mean there's a moral duty for them to collapse or anything like that, I just mean that as a description. They just have to collapse. It's seen that there is just this, it ain't going anywhere. And if it ain't going anywhere, there is nothing to work for in the future. You know, there is no salvation in the arms of the sweet Lord Jesus, because that's in the future. There is no age of enlightenment to come, because that's in the future. There is no, not even saving of the planet ecologically, because that is in the future. So in a sense, when the self collapses, all of that collapses. No more stories of meaning and purpose. There is no meaning and purpose. There is no meaning and purpose, and there doesn't need to be. I mean, that statement, there is no meaning and purpose, can sometimes be heard by certain individuals with an air of kind of inexpressible existential sadness and disappointment and regret. But that's not how I mean it. You know, there is no meaning and purpose, and there doesn't have to be. I nearly said there because there doesn't have to be, but that's too purposive. There's no purpose at work here. There is no meaning and purpose, and there doesn't need to be. We could say the reason we need and construct and invent meaning and purpose is because the person living in separation feels so wounded by that, so hurt, so incomplete, that they have to desperately look for something, we have to desperately look for something to make ourselves feel okay. Now, some of us it'll be heroin, some of us it'll be vodka, but many of us it will be meaning and purpose. I mean, it's great to have a meaning and purpose. It's wonderful to get up out of bed in the morning, you know, and think that, you know, to ward off the horror of living as a separate person, separate from the world and everything else. It's wonderful to ward off that horror by waking up in the morning and thinking, okay, today, after I've had my shave and my porridge, I am going to knock on 47 doors, and that will be 2 more than last week, to bring the word of the Lord to them, and to give them the Watchtower magazine or whatever it might be. I mean, it is clearly, psychologically, a wonderful thing to have meaning and purpose in that way. And we might regard it with absolute horror, you know, that can fall away in an instant, and believe me, it can fall away in an instant, but we don't need to regard it with horror, because the purpose of stories of meaning and purpose is to bolster the sense of self against the battening of the hostile world in which it finds itself. So when the sense of self has collapsed, surprise, surprise, there is no separate sense within a hostile world that it needs to protect itself against. There is just this. And in a way, the kind of glory of it is that at the same moment that all those stories of meaning and purpose collapse and become utterly, utterly ridiculous, in that same moment they are no longer needed. because they collapse when the sense of self collapses, and when the sense of self collapses, I no longer need to protect myself because I move around inside a separate universe, which can sometimes seem hostile. I think I kind of overdid it in what I said before. It can sometimes seem hostile. So when the distinction, you see, the basic point of separation, you know, we talk about separation, the individual, the person lives in a state of separation. What are they separate from? Everything else. And we talk about non-duality and duality. What composes duality? Two things: the self, and then the world in which the self moves. They're perceived as separate. That's duality. There's me, and there's everything else, and everything else includes you lots, and the camera, and the bus, everything, the cosmos, the universe, even Balaam and Clapham, who knows? So that's duality, that's living in duality. When that collapses, then there's just oneness, unity, non-duality, whatever we want to call it. Because that separate person moving around inside this stuff called the world is seen to be non-existent. And then there's just the world and the phenomena that appear as the world. Or there's just the world appearing as everything that happens, as whatever happens. And so the stories collapse. This can be a terrible shock, particularly if we're really convinced of the stories. I mean, you know, we could be a really convinced whatever Christian, or we could be really convinced by the story of psychotherapy, or the story of the law of attraction, or something like that. Any of those stories, and many, many others, can grip us. It would be a tremendous shock to see them completely collapse. And it can also be a tremendous relief. And then what's left? No more story, no more meaning, no more purpose. What's left? Just whatever's happening. But whatever's happening can now be seen to have the richness that it really contains, because we're no longer seeing it through a veil or a fog of meaning. Now at last, the squirrel climbing the tree trunk in the park, that is not an easy sentence to say, I'm not going to try and repeat it. Now at last, that can be seen, I don't know how to complete that sentence, in the glory that it has, because it's no longer being seen through a fog of anxiety and neurosis that I've got a 10-minute lunch break now, but I only managed to do 20 of my 47 knock on the door houses this morning. That means I've got to do even more this afternoon. God, this satchel full of the Watchtower, it's really heavy to lug around on a hot day. So how can the squirrel on the tree trunk, how can it be seen for what it really is? A manifestation of oneness, when there's that story running, that story of meaning in the head, in the head, the nagging in the head. And so after the seeing of this, after the seeing of oneness, anything can happen. But the stories are pretty certain to collapse, and life is likely to be seen much more in the raw. And I feel like adding for good and ill, for good or ill, everything much more in the raw. The squirrel on the tree trunk, much more in the raw. A flash of anger, much more in the raw. Can I just mention, can I just sort of throw in as a little advertisement that I'm not being paid for this. If any Netflix, somebody, a philosopher friend, put me onto this, a documentary called Holy Hell, which I hadn't come across, but I have now, and it's wonderful. And it's about a bizarre guru cult, which I've never heard of. It's quite a small cult in America in the 80s, 90s, and it's still going now, actually. And it's a wonderful, it's a bit like that documentary Kumari. It's a wonderful insight you know, into what the mind can create out of its desperation to feel that it has found a path out of, you know, the wretched personal state of being stuck in this world when we yearn for something more beautiful than this. So if any of you do have access to Netflix, I'll really recommend it.
Holy Hell.
Holy Hell.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
it's cool.
Interesting.
Anyway.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you talked about you know, this like halfway stage, like it's like a limbo stage, you know, in a sort of use a Christian metaphor. You said
We can't avoid Christian metaphors, unfortunately, because
No.
of 2,000 years of conditioning, but there you go, what can you do?
But this sort of glimpse of this, when the glimpse is seen, but the glimpse is seen when the self is absent,
Yeah,
because it can't be seen by the self.
yes.
But so the glimpse is seen, but then, unless the person completely falls away, it returns, and then there's a sense of, oh, what was that?
Yeah, what the hell was
What the
that
hell was
sometimes?
that? And actually, yeah, then the sort of, then the need to then try and return
Yeah.
to that place,
Yeah.
which it would describe as a state,
Yeah,
wouldn't it?
it will describe it as a
As a
state
state.
probably because it can't think of it in any other way.
Yes,
Because the self lives in time.
Yes.
States exist in time, yeah.
Like a stunt, you said, like a what? What word did you use?
State.
A state.
State.
The state. S-T-A-T-A. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, a
So
kind
the
of
self-
mode of existence. The self
Yeah,
will see it as a specific mode of existence, which it can somehow, or it hopes it can somehow get back to. Yeah, yeah, it's inevitable. Yeah,
So, I mean, obviously, you talked about words, using words, and we're a bit restricted in terms of the words we use to describe something. But when it's said that this is seen, or there's a glimpse, could one just say, well, it's just seen by itself? So
it's seen by, yeah.
if you're talking
it's a
about
good way of
oneness
saying
or-
it. It's seen. Did you say it's seen by itself? Yeah, it's as good a way as any.
Oneness is just getting a glimpse
Yeah.
of itself.
I tell you what or who it is not seen by. It is not seen by me or by you. So however we want to describe that, it's seen by itself, it's seen by oneness, it's oneness recognising itself, whatever you want to say. Or you could just say it's not seen by anything or anyone, it's just the natural state of being. If there is a psychophysical organism, a body-mind running, if there's a body-mind running, it's just the natural way of being or the natural way of seeing when the self isn't there, when the self collapses. But it's not like anything is seeing it, and nothing needs to see it, or nothing is seeing it or experiencing it. Something is seeing and experiencing all of this as a person in separation, you know. But what's experiencing or seeing oneness, if that were right? Nothing. Nothing. It's just the natural state when there isn't a person running. It's almost like, you know, the person's almost like a program, you know, and when that stops, even if it's just for an instant, then what's seen is just the natural state, which is this. If it's just for a split second, it may be this just simply in its emptiness, because what's often seen in a sudden awakening is the emptiness of everything. But then if that is seen completely, then what it's seen is that it's both empty and full, as I've said many times before. And it's kind of that sort of puts an end to everything. It's the seeing that this is empty and full. Who is seeing it? Nobody's seeing it. What is seeing it? Nothing's seeing it. It's just the natural, I'm going to have to say state of being, even though that's misleading. It's the natural state of being when the person isn't, you know, that program isn't running. And there does seem to be, I keep using the word seem to because I'm a bit cautious, but this is reported in many cases. You know, there seems to be something about seeing the emptiness of this, which the Buddhists talk about a lot, which doesn't in itself stop that personal program running. But when the emptiness of this is seen and its fullness, that seems to stop the sense of self in its tracks. And it doesn't mean that everything else necessarily stops. You know, all sorts of psychological and emotional stuff can still go on. You know, we're not talking about a perfected state of being in that sense. All sorts of things can still go on. But it puts an end to that program which is constantly asserting, this is happening to me, this is happening to me, this is happening to me, and I am separate from the world in which I live. Something about seeing the fullness of everything as well as the emptiness of everything just puts a full stop to that.
So
I think it's a very, very brave person that then makes any assertion about what might happen next, because anything might happen next, because there aren't any rules. And there are plenty of stories there about what might happen next, that life is just going to be absolutely hunky-dory from now on, and it's all going to be singing and dancing or whatever it may be. There's plenty of very seductive stories, but actually everything is unpredictable. And occasionally I think it's a wonderful saying. Some people find it depressing. I don't. I mean, it's wonderful, that Greek say, call no man happy, call no man or no woman happy until they are dead. In other words, everything's completely unpredictable. It is completely unpredictable. As soon as we construct a story about what life must be when this is seen, we risk making a mighty fool of ourselves. So anything can happen, but it's not going to happen to a person, and that is quite a big difference. In fact, it's the only difference that really matters.
it seems that there isn't any center. in
Absolutely, there's no centre.
this. There wasn't any center.
Yeah,
It's just things there, but no this center where
Yeah.
everything sort of relates to it, just
Yeah.
not there.
it's the sense of self that gives the sense of
Yeah.
centre. So when that's gone, no sense.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
And none of it matters. And none of it matters.
Yeah.
And it might seem to matter.
Yeah.
And it might seem to matter.
Yes.
Anything can seem to matter. You know, whether I get my next cup of coffee or the love of the sweet Lord Jesus. Anything can seem to matter. Of course, nothing matters. Things matter when they're viewed from the perspective of the separate self. Then things matter desperately. But nothing matters. However, there's a trap in there, a lovely spiritual trap, because the mind, the ego, the person hears that and they go, okay, that means nothing should matter to me, which means I should not have any preferences. So here I sit, a perfected being, and I have no preferences. I have risen above all of that. No, that's garbage. Nothing matters in the sense that nothing has any meaning. This isn't going anywhere. There is no future into which this could go. But for the body-mind organism, there may well still be preferences. So in that sense, you might say, well, something matters. It matters to me whether my coffee is fresh ground or instant. That matters a huge amount to me. Try giving me a cup of instant coffee and see how much it matters to me. And yet, nothing matters.
Even cake.
Okay, I'm going for blood tests on Monday for cholesterol and glucose. Don't talk to me about cake, please. Cake is not allowed to matter to me anymore. I'm going to change the title of that third book to Drink, Tea, Eat Rice Cakes.
Much more healthy.
After my latest visit to the doctor.
Oh. So that's why you don't want to take those biscuits home.
I do not, that is exactly why I don't want to take those biscuits home.
She
Absolutely.
said,
absolutely. If the packet's open, I can't take them out. Yeah.
So they're saying,
Such a
yeah.
long time. Sorry,
Go on.
so much, because I'm very old now. And
So am I.
yeah.
I don't know how it happened.
All that time when
Yeah.
suddenly it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not all that nice sometimes, but it doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Yeah. All that time that actually doesn't exist.
Yes.
You know, because there's just this. And I mean, that can sound like one of the most outrageous things that someone that sits in chairs like this, in other rooms as well as this, in London and other parts of the world, it can sound like that is one of the most outrageous things that you can say, the denial of time. The denial of time. You know, but there's, I am sitting here and I am denying the existence of time. How ridiculous is that? How stupid or eccentric or mad is that? And yet I'm doing it. And I'd say two things about it. One is, going back to what I said earlier, in a way, it's simply obvious, isn't it? That there is just this. There isn't a minute ago or a second ago or even 1/10 of a second into the future. There is just this. We can't even talk about the duration of this. It doesn't have a duration. We can't sit here, well, we could sit here and argue about how long this is. Is it a microsecond, half a second, a nanosecond? It's ridiculous. Because it has no time. There is just this. And in one sense, that is, although it's very challenging in a different way, in one sense, that is kind of obvious. But there's something else about this which really all anyone can do is describe. You know, I can't justify it philosophically or logically or in any other way. All I can say is that here, and I know in many, 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 many other individuals, even a split second of seeing an emptiness destroys the reality of the past and the future. It just destroys it. It just empties it out of any reality. I've talked about this a lot, including, particularly in the past, because of course the future is full of hope, but the past is full of memories. Most of us have more memories than hope. And what happens in even a split seeing of this is that the life just kind of instantly evaporates from all those memories. So they kind of still exist factually. It's not like having our memory banks wiped. So I don't know why this afternoon I've gone a bit into sort of artificial intelligence computer kind of metaphor, but I don't know, just ignore that. But it's not like having our memories wiped. The biographical information is still there, but it's just seen as no reality. It's just bang, whatever. If we're 55, when there's a glimpse of this, that 55 years of apparent past just collapses down into nothing. Whilst the biographical memory is still intact. The energy just goes out of it. It's maybe, I don't know if this is a good analogy, it's maybe like waking up in the morning from a very convincing dream, which you can still remember, but the moment you wake up, you see it in a completely different light. Like you're in it, it's experienced as reality. The moment you wake up, the information in the dream is still all there, but instantly it's known that it had no reality. Perhaps it's like that. I think our late comer from Shropshire is here.
Yeah, you were, what can I say? Yes. You were saying that, there's no rules, but basically there are tendencies. And when it is seen, anything can happen, anything can arise, but there tends to be certain tendencies. But I suppose while there is a multitude of psychophysical organisms, then when the person falls away, how that is seen or how that manifests can vary according to that multitude multitude of psychophysical organisms. Although, as you said, there are tendencies, there tend to be tendencies. Yeah. So how it's seen or how it's interpreted can be different. Can be seen different.
How it's interpreted can certainly be wildly different,
Yeah.
it can be. And when I say that, where were we? Just remind me.
Just that sort of idea of when it...
Memory
it's
just
seen.
totally destroys
When it's-
memory. It really does.
That's one tendency.
Yeah. Memory becomes really bad. Yeah.
It's the interpretation,
One tendency.
isn't it? The interpretation of how things are seen, you know.
But the interpretation can vary wildly,
Yeah.
as must be obvious. Yeah. But you mentioned a couple of other things there.
Yeah, because it's... Well, it's not... Well, I was thinking because there's because there's a multitude of psychophysical organisms, while that exists, then when a person falls away, but there's still a psychophysical organism there, how that loss of the person, how that loss of that sense of self has gone, how that then manifests, you know, how life then proceeds.
Oh, how life then proceeds,
After that.
absolutely, in infinitely variable
Variation.
way.
Although there may be certain
I'm tempted to
tendency.
I'm tempted to say that in the actual, and God, words are so difficult, I want to say in the
Yeah,
actual
yeah.
experience
Oh, yeah.
of seeing this, but of course it's not an experience, so forgive that. I would say there is a tremendous commonality actually, because all that variety, all that variation that you're talking about is on the level of the person, the psychophysical person, if you like. So in that moment or whatever it might be, when that is not there, what is revealed when it's reported on afterwards, there does tend to be a huge commonality and similarity in it. But of course, then what manifests in the existence of an individual, if they haven't died of shock at the point of seeing this, which I'm sure some do, of course, infinite variety, infinitely varied. But with very strong tendencies, and I mean one of those tendencies, for example, is that there will probably be less agony about the past and the future because it's been seen for him. Yeah.
Is it like the same thing's heard, but it comes in different tunes? It's just like a different instrument that it's being played on, but it's in fact it's the same thing that's heard.
Yeah, if you're talking about, for example, you know, what happens, so this may be seen, and then there's the life of a body-mind still continuing, then yes, absolutely. In terms of the actual seeing of this, I'm not so sure. I think there is a tremendous commonality, and the reason for that is because the person with all their infinite variety is literally not there at that moment. So what is seen at that moment, and I'm using the word moment metaphorically as well, obviously, but what is actually seen at that moment, you know, it's not coloured by the individual in any way because the individual ain't there. Now, a split second later, the individual may be back interpreting it in a wildly different way from the way that Jim and Tom did last week or whatever. You know, but the actual, you see again, words are so difficult. I want to say the actual experience, and I can't because it isn't an experience, but the actual thing, whatever it is, it's like the multifarious, colourful differences in people don't matter because they're not there. You know, I haven't seen oneness. You will not see oneness. No one has ever seen oneness. No one ever will see oneness. No person.
I mean, this might be a completely different thing, but I've heard when people are talking about, you know, some particular, I use the word psychophysical organism because it's a good one.
Yeah, why not?
Has
Very romantic.
has awakened or you know, had a liberation. Is the idea, well, don't follow anybody else because it's unique. You know, so somebody might look at somebody else and think, oh, they had an awakening, so I will then use them as a sort of template
And do what they did.
and do what they did in order to achieve the same thing. You know, but
It's a natural thing for the mind to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, I would say, you know, I'd make a distinction. I don't know how many would agree with this. You know, I say, you know, there are teachers and there are mystics. I'm using both words in quite a loose sense. You know, if you want a teaching, go to a teacher. They'll give you a teaching. Of course they will. That's what teachers are for. That cannot have anything to do with what we're talking about here, because teachings have to be about experiences. And what we're talking about here is not an experience. Right? So if you want teachings, go to a teacher. If you want a description of this, for some bizarre reason, because it's no practical use whatsoever, but nevertheless, if you want a description of it, go to a mystic, because that's all the mystic. The only thing a mystic can do is try to give you a description of it. You know, I've often said this before, mystics really only know one thing. All mystics know is there is no self. And they also know they can't teach you how to get to that. So the mystic doesn't bother to give a teaching. The teacher does, because that's what teachers do. There's nothing wrong with either of those. You know, they're all part of life's rich, wonderful pattern or pageant. Yeah.
In a way, there is no use in mystics in that respect.
There's no use.
No use in mystics.
No, there's no use in anything.
In that respect.
There's no use in anything, but it's a kind of entertainment to get us from birth to death.
No, I mean from that point of view, from those who want the way or whatever. Mystic has no use.
No, well, there's no use in teachers either. So what?
They think maybe.
You know, it's what's happening.
Yeah.
You know, this kind of feels a desire to see a teacher, it'll see a teacher. The teacher will give it something to do, because that's what teachers do, then this will do it. Well, fine, it doesn't matter, it's fine. It doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, though. The only difference is that you go to the mystic, that will probably be a bit closer. What the mystic says will probably be a little bit closer to what we're, you know, what we're trying to communicate. But it won't be very close, because it's impossible.
Yeah, but there will be some metaphors which might sort of point.
And this metaphor might strike home there, and something completely different over there. Yeah, of course.
But I've got a volume of Meister Eckert's translation of Meister Eckert's homilies, and stamp. It's from America, Americans. Stamp of the library. It's taken out of circulation. Nobody needs that. Which
this takes the person.
It's a mystic. Nobody needs mystic.
No.
There.
No, but they keep popping up.
Taken out of circulation.
Well, that's a good metaphor for what happens to the person when they say this. The person is taken out of circulation.
Yes.
Yeah, that is one.
What's that CIA phrase? Terminated with extreme prejudice. That's it. The person is terminated with extreme prejudice in the seeing of this. No more person, just an empty shell. This is, you know, zombies. These talks could be renamed the dawn of the zombies.
When you say this isn't an experience, do you just mean there's nobody there to have an experience?
Yes.
But there's still experience?
No. Well, sorry, when I say this, I mean, you know, that what, I mean like the seeing of emptiness, the seeing of oneness, what's sometimes called an event, is not an experience, because there's no one there for whom that is happening. That's what I mean.
But it's kind of an experience, just nobody having it.
This is where language breaks down. That's the trouble, you see. We have to talk about it, so it sounds like it is kind of an experience, but it isn't, because experiences happen to people, and this doesn't happen to people. But language has simply broken down. So if we want to say, well, it's kind of an experience as a way of trying to explain something, then that's as good as anything. We can say that. If we were so foolish as to be trying to explain this to somebody in a pub one night, who's come up to us and put their arm rather drunkenly around us, like, what these meetings you go to? I mean, if we were so foolish as to try to explain it, we might well say that, yeah. There's no way of describing it, so we're going to have to use a bad way, and one bad way is as good as another.
So just experience never, perhaps it's a silly question, but experience doesn't happen anymore after it's seen.
No, experience will happen after it's seen unless seeing coincides with physical death. When I say it's not an experience, I'm talking about that actual, what you might call an event of seeing.
Okay.
Yeah. So, after that, experience will probably still arise, but not if there's been a fatal coronary event, which I'm sure there sometimes is, and this is seen. Yeah.
But everything else continues, so I mean, if you want to, there may not be an experience in the sense of somebody experiencing it in the form of a person, but there's just experiencing.
Yeah.
So seeing takes place, hearing takes place, sound of the siren, sensing, perceiving.
Yeah. We're back to.
But it's just that these are all not taking place. They're not being mediated through a person.
Yes.
Just seeing take place, hearing take place, perceiving, sensing takes place.
Yes.
Sense of taste, tasting, smelling, touching takes place.
Yes.
It's just not being mediated for a separate person.
Yes. And that's a profound difference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There is no comparison between me having a cup of coffee and a cup of coffee being drunk. Yeah. Or me seeing that squirrel on the tree trunk and the seeing of that simply happening. There's no comparison. Yeah. And there's no way of describing what that distinction is either. Yeah.
No, we obviously can't talk about when the person falls away being an experience, that we put that to one side, but taking your own situation as in a sense, this idea of when the person has gone, has disappeared, emotions, feelings can still rise up quite strongly.
More powerfully than before, quite possibly.
And this is something that I've actually heard, from other sources about, because there's no person there to sort of censor and edit and mediate those feelings.
Exactly.
So if viewpoints were held before, then they can also be held afterwards.
Viewpoints. Yeah, it's possible, but I would say less likely.
Yeah.
Because viewpoints are different to emotions and feelings. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Feelings, I would say, are likely to get stronger, not weaker, because they are no longer mediated and dampened down by a neurotic mind. And I often quote, the Korean Zen master, I think it was, who said, "No one knows sorrow like a Zen master." And you might as well say, or anger, or laughter, or whatever. But viewpoints are different. So anything can happen. They may still be held strongly or not, but I would say less likely to become stronger. Because viewpoints rely on stories. And stories are less likely to be taken so seriously. Yeah. And again, it doesn't matter, and we can, we can find all sorts of kind of spiritual, in inverted commas, stories, which says that there should be no opinions. If there are still opinions, then the ultimate seeing of the ultimate 37th level of enlightenment cannot have happened. Again, that's another kind of quite nice spiritual story, and it gives fuel for those who want to teach and those who want to be taught.
But maybe that's an interpretation that will be given by a person, that there should be no opinions, and suddenly you've got this sort of equanimity all the time in the face of adversity and everything.
It's a very attractive thought.
Yeah.
I mean, we want to, it's natural, isn't it? We want to kind of be rid of suffering, rise above suffering and so forth. I mean, that's kind of natural. So it's a very attractive thought that there can be rising above all of that. It's just another story. It doesn't have anything to do with holding opinions or not holding opinions, really. But it is likely that they won't be taken so seriously.
Was that?
But you see, I mean, we talked about preferences, and I mean, usually, giving a very trivial example, like, if I liked honey before liberation, then why wouldn't there be a liking for honey afterwards? But to a certain extent, that might also go for certain opinions about the world, political opinions, social opinions, and so forth. Why not? Why should they change? Why not? It doesn't matter. It's not part of anything important. It's just stuff happening. It's all just stuff happening. It's players on a stage. It's actors in a film.
I mean, was it noticed here that emotions might rise more strongly than before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Might do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would sum it up as, it is likely that there may be stronger emotions and less neurosis. Because neurosis is fueled by story. Yeah. So the story that keeps the neurosis going is likely to diminish or die away. But emotions are natural, and again, I've said this several times before as well. I mean, I talk about kind of natural and neurotic feelings. So not all emotions are equal in that sense. So a natural feeling might be fear, but a neurotic feeling might be embarrassment. Yeah? So they don't exist in quite the same way. So as I've said often before, natural feelings might become stronger, might be felt more strongly. Neurotic feelings are likely to diminish or perhaps die away. Irritation is a neurotic feeling, anger is a natural feeling. Irritation is a neurotic version of anger. Irritation is what I feel when my neurosis won't allow me to feel anger. One of the differences between anger and irritation is that anger doesn't usually go on for more than a few seconds or a few minutes, whereas irritation can go on for years. Most of us know somebody who's been irritated for the last 20 years. So, again, absolutely no rules, but it is probable that irritation will reduce or die away. There might be more anger. Now, notice that in the relationships for that individual in their life, that could be extremely disturbing. The partner and friends and children who have learnt how to live with the constant irritation of this person find it very difficult to adjust to the fact that they are not irritated anymore, but occasionally they come out with flashes of anger instead. So, again, we've looked at this before as well. This can be very disturbing in the relationships in the life of this apparent person. The stories they believed in could die. That can be very disturbing for the other individuals in their life. The way they manifest emotions can change radically. That can be very disturbing for the other individuals in their life. You notice that in some traditions, the advice or sometimes the demand is you cut yourself off from your own life entirely. If you want this, if you're going to pursue enlightenment, which is not a phrase I would use very often, then you go, you shave off your hair, you change your name, you cut yourself off from everyone that you've known in the past, and you go into the jungle or whatever with your guru. Well, in a sense, you could say, well, actually, that's not bad advice, in a way. Because if this seeing does happen, it's likely to be quite a pain to everybody else in your family circle and friendship group. It might be a kindness for them to cut themselves off from us. They don't have to put up with the new you.
Yeah, especially if you have make the mistake of talking about it.
Particularly if you make the mistake of talking about it. Yeah. I don't want to bang on about this because this all gets a bit psychological. I'm probably a bit too unhealthily interested in that side of things. I say unhealthily for the purpose of these talks. I don't mean it's unhealthy to be interested in that stuff, but just in terms of these talks. But just very simply, just take take the example of a codependent relationship. Well, if anything happens to reduce or destroy the codependence of one of those people, the relationship will probably fall apart. Well, seeing this, what we're talking about here, seeing oneness is very likely to destroy the codependence that's there. That codependence is neurotic anyway. Well, that's likely to have a very destabilising effect on the relationship. Just as much as if you both run a little ashram in your house for your beloved guru, or if one of you is a convinced evangelical Christian, or both of you rather are convinced evangelical Christians. Any very powerful story that is the glue that holds you together like that, it's likely to come unstuck if one of you sees this.
Does awakening always lead to liberation? If we just always...
In the sense that we're all going to die, yes. But in the sense that I think you may be asking that question, then no.
So you can have an awakening and not necessarily
Yes.
be liberated?
Yeah. Yeah, until death. At death there's only liberation.
Sure.
But yes, there can be awakening and then... Yeah. And the way I describe that, and I mean there's so many ways, any rules about this are absurd, and any description of it is provisional. You must understand that. But one of the ways I describe that, is awakening. It can be like this: is that awakening is seeing the emptiness of everything, and if it happens suddenly, it can be a tremendous shock. Liberation is seeing the fullness of everything. And that's what seems to put a full stop to the existence of a separate person. But yes, there can be awakening, the seeing of emptiness, and then life goes on like that. That having happened, that having apparently taken place. Yeah, that can happen. Yeah.
But there can be also maybe gentle awakening of gentle.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be so strong and
No.
powerful as, for example, the first time, so-called.
Yeah.
It just everything different slightly.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like very.
Yeah. Nisargadatta said it can be fast or slow, and the fast is not better than the slow. The only thing I would say is that, and I mean, this doesn't matter at all, the only thing I would say is that if there is a kind of an event, a sudden event, of the kind, or more than one of the kind that we're talking about, it can make things clearer to the mind. That doesn't matter at all.
It's been already, but now it sort of seems it's more like gentle, the same but more gentle.
Yeah.
No, I probably that's because I still memory of that strong, powerful something.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be. It doesn't mean to be like that. At all.
And there's no shoulds about this.
Yeah.
And no oughts about it, and what happens,
Then-
as always, is what happens.
Yeah.
This obeys that universal rule. This is what is happening. And it is always what is happening.
Yeah, but then I sometimes start comparing,
Of course.
and it's not that. It's not
That's
that.
the mind.
No, you're still sort of in the model. or
That's the
something.
mind. That's how the mind
But-
works. Yeah.
Then it can be this seduction of the mind, which sort of censures everything and
Yeah.
compares and.
In a way, it's the way the mind keeps itself in control.
Yeah.
The mind has a story. It always has a story.
Yeah.
And it keeps itself in
Tiny
control
one.
in that
It's
way.
a tiny one, but it's
Yeah.
a story.
But notice that, of course, we are talking in metaphorically here. It sounds like there are these warring parts of ourselves. It's almost like there's a higher part of myself that wants enlightenment, and my mind wants to drag me back to the story. It's not that at all. It's just, when I say the mind, I simply mean a flow of thoughts. There isn't a separate part of ourselves called the mind, of course not. But thoughts come up, and thoughts often tell a story. And the story will often be, if I do this, it will get me somewhere.
I mean, suffering sort of really does seem to be very closely aligned with the story, isn't there? Of the person.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the big things is when this is seen, or if one gets a glimpse, or even if one has a sort of permanent awakening or liberation, whatever, it's the sense that
Nothing's permanent, but let that go.
right, okay, or even
No, that would get all right.
Yeah. that stuff still arises, thoughts still arise, emotions still arise, feelings still arise. But the big difference is when the me doesn't attach the story
Yeah.
to it. Because that attachment is it just unfolds on this sort of permanent roller coaster of the story that goes on and on and on, and you get wound up in this whole angst.
Yeah.
But when things are seen, and you think, when it's realised it's a story, in the same way that when you awake from a dream, and you realise, that was a dream.
Yeah.
Then it's let go, much more easily.
Yeah.
And that's suffering is less likely to happen or to persist.
It's less likely to persist.
Yeah.
Yes. Suffering in some ways can get stronger because it's no longer mediated by the neurotic self, but suffering is less likely to hang around for so long. It's more likely to, I'm just remembering here one of the most unpleasant metaphors I've ever used, which is the metaphor of the fly paper in the room.
Oh yes.
And the flies come in, so the fly is whatever piece of neurotic pain or thought or whatever it might be, and they stick to the fly paper, so they're there in the room, and eventually the fly paper becomes absolutely covered in these dead, horrible flies. So this in a way is like what happens when the hook falls out of the ceiling and the fly paper falls to the floor or whatever, and now the flies can fly in through one window and they buzz around for a while and then they just fly out through another window. So the self is very sticky. You know, suffering sticks to the self, neurotic thoughts stick to the self, neurotic beliefs and stories stick to the self. So when the self's gone, then this stuff may come up, but it's much more likely to die away again more quickly. I think the way Tony puts this is very nice when he talks about, you know, these things, they come and they knock on the door, but there's no one there anymore to invite them in and to say, oh, come in, sit down and have a cup of tea and a piece of cake. Oh, and by the way, make me completely miserable for the next 48 hours as well. Yeah, so that's also...
Invite them to stay permanently.
Or indeed, invite them to stay permanently. Yeah, why don't you move into my spare room and torture me night and day for the next 20 years?
But the
Because I know, I ruined my life when I was 23, when I should have married Mary. Yeah, exactly.
But often the self may even go to therapy and talk round the story.
Yeah.
And when a window or a door is offered, runs a mile.
Oh, of
Because it's
course.
so caught up with identity.
Yeah, of course.
And but would not accept that actually a holding on is taking place.
Of course, yeah, because one of the things, we love security, and so one of the things that we often end up loving is our prisons, even when the door's open, and, I'm aware, I'm looking at the great man myself, you can't see him, but he's behind you, R.D. Lang. We're sitting here in the Philadelphia Association, this temple to the dearly beloved Ronnie, and of course this is one of the things that, this is one of his metaphors, isn't it? That we sit in a prison with the door wide open, but we're unable to leave it. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that example I get, I have for the last 30 years I have been lamenting the fact that I ruined my life when I didn't marry Mary when I was 24, is an example of sitting in a prison with the door wide open. No one is keeping me imprisoned in there, but I am keeping myself in there. Yeah. And psychotherapy is obviously a very intelligent thing to do in a lot of circumstances, but basically psychotherapy is about helping us to get up, realise the prison door is open and walk out of it into the clear light of day. And what we're talking about here is the possibility of realising there is no one in the prison. There's no need to get up and walk out of the prison because there's no one in it. And that is a radical difference, but that does not invalidate psychotherapy in any way
It felt like it
whatsoever.
did for a long time. It felt like it did for a long time. It made it very difficult to practice, but there is a place beyond through that, if you like.
Absolutely, for the client, where there is a glimpse of this or the seeing of this, it can be difficult to be with a psychotherapist who doesn't have a feel for this. And for the psychotherapist who sees this, there can be that feeling, oh, this invalidates what I'm doing. Well, it doesn't at all. Of course it doesn't, no. I mean, any more than, it doesn't invalidate car mechanics, by the way. If you need a car puncture repaired, the fact that there is no one and there is the seeing that there is only this and there's no past and no future does not invalidate quick fit. It doesn't. And sometimes the mind gets hold of a story that it does, and that's quite a good way to trash your life, and people do trash their lives in those ways. I tell the story of somebody who used to ring me up from America. There'd been a seeing of this, and there'd also been a story in the mind that said, well, okay, now this has been seen, the universe will support me and I don't want to work anymore. And each time, this chap used to phone me, maybe roughly monthly intervals, and each time he was in a worse and worse state economically. Well, what a surprise that is! And the last time I heard from him, and I didn't hear from him after this. He phoned me to tell me that he was being thrown out of his apartment because he couldn't pay the rent anymore, and in a couple of days' time he was moving into Tent City. So his mind told him that the universe would support him, and it did. It supported him into moving into Tent City. So this doesn't invalidate anything in what, on the one hand, we could call the dream world, and on the other hand, we could call the real world, and guess what? They're the same thing. The dream world is the real world is the dream world. And if we want to pay the mortgage, it's probably a good idea to have a job. Probably. Somebody once, one of the very first talks I ever gave about this, somebody said to me, you know, if this happened to me, it would be dreadful, because I wouldn't get up and go to work in the morning. Well, do you live in a house? And he said, yeah. I said, well, do you prefer living in a house, or would you rather live in a ditch? He said, no, I like living in a house. Well, you'll probably get up and go to work then, because the mortgage needs to be paid.
That kind of opens the discussion towards the dear old free will, doesn't it? So who's making the
Absolutely,
decision
of course it does.
to go to work?
No one
Not
is
go to
making the
work.
decision. Oh, of course. No one's making
So
those decisions.
our pal in America then?
Our
You know,
pal in America
well,
is
who's
oneness,
making- yeah.
moving from an apartment
Yeah.
into Tent City.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. That's a real bummer for the stories we love as well. Oh God, we're nearly at the tea break. We could come back to that after tea if we wanted to, the free will thing. But that is a real bummer for the stories. Yeah. And it's interesting to notice how strongly that is resisting the free, the lack of the non-existence of free will. It is fiercely resisted out there in what I laughingly call, in air quotations, the real world.
Well, the positive thing is because it resisted so strongly, because it's very persuasive.
Well, it's very persuasive.
seductive.
It's very persuasive and seductive because there has been so, in the story of time, there has been so much conditioning.
And who would we blame? Who would we blame? Who's responsible?
Maybe we could take blame out of it, you see. Yeah.
Exactly.
But there's such a force of conditioning. It's quite obvious that there is a huge resistance to dropping the idea of free will and choice. But I mean, huge philosophical resistance and political resistance, and the arguments go on, and people write great books about them. Some of these books are actually quite interesting, or whatever. And coming back to what we're talking about here, one split second of seeing and forget about all of that because it just becomes obvious. And maybe the mind might then reassert itself, but then if this is seen in its fullness, it's just obvious there's no one. So as there's no one, the idea of free will doesn't even arise. It's not so much that free will collapses, the sense that there is anyone who could operate free will collapses. So of course free will is a non-starter. And just to reiterate, this is the new book, and this is most definitely not about non-duality, so don't buy it for a non-dual purpose and then have an issue with me. This is about everything else under the sun, to do with spirituality and psychotherapy and religion and belief, but not to non-duality. So that's now available on Amazon.
So are you going to bring some next time?
Hopefully.
Yeah.
I intend to have some hopefully soon, and hopefully in time for next time, yes.
So the new book is a work of fiction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This new book is the story of my seeking life, my 30 years or more of seeking mine. So in that sense, of course, yeah, it is a work of fiction. I mean, in conventional terms, it's a work of fact. But in our terms, it's a work of fiction because it's about the story of the seeking Richard. There's
Just read the introduction. Enjoyed it very much.
Oh, good. There you go. There you go. If you want to get a flavour of it, have a quick glance at the back cover, and on a scale of 0 to 10, decide how offended you feel. And I suggest that if the level of offence it's causing you is above 5, it's probably worth buying just for the entertainment. If it's below 5, maybe not.
Richard,
There's still justice.
when at the last Tony meeting, which I think you were there, somebody asked him about a book which of his books to recommend, and he said This Freedom, which I think came out in 2015. And I had it at home and I read it again, and it really is, it's quite superb. Probably not as good as...
Could you just edit that?
But he talks quite a bit about contracted energy. And he says that the sense of me, or the sense of self with a small s, is not just an idea. It's not just sort of I am Philip or whatever. And therefore it cannot be removed by saying I am the self with a capital S, or I am absolute, or whatever. So this contracted energy seems to be, in inverted commas, the cause of the problem. Firstly, can you say...
Or manifestation of the problem.
And then of course he says it doesn't actually exist anyway.
Yeah.
But, so can you talk a little bit about this contracted energy?
Yeah.
And the second question would be, just as in the physical world, if you've got a spasm in your back, which you could liken to a contracted energy, you would go and see a physiotherapist who would ease that contraction. Why is there nothing you can do to remove the contracted energy, to let it flow, or to let it be less contracted?
Yeah, what was the first question?
Well, just to talk about the contracted energy, what
absolutely.
that actually is.
Yeah. I mean, insofar as words can get anywhere near this, which of course they can't, that's a very good description, and it's a description I've certainly used a lot myself. It's absolutely what we're talking about here in terms of the sense of self, the sense of being a person, the sense of being separate. It is not an idea. It can be an idea, but the fact that this is an idea is irrelevant, and there may be, conceivably, none of that idea whatsoever hanging around in what we could call the mind, and that is irrelevant. It is absolutely, it is an energy, it's an energetic contraction, and how can I put it? So again, even a split second of awakening, as we sometimes call it, it's like that contraction, just bang, and it's gone. But the thing about awakening like that is then it can be very, very quickly back again. So absolutely, this is held in, I mean, any description, of course, is just words and ideas in a way, but we could say it is held in the psychophysical organism. It is almost literally like a tightness. And the problem with it is that because that has been how it, because it's always been like that since I have been conscious of myself as a being. I mean, maybe not the moment I was born, but when the moment I was born, there's no processing going on in the mental machinery. But once I become conscious of myself as a being, it's like that contraction has always been there, and because it's always been there, it's never noticed, because it seems like the natural state of affairs. It's like, I don't know, say, we've lived all our life in a cinema and there's only been black and white films showing. So we don't miss the colour because we don't know it exists. So we don't miss the freedom of the uncontracted possibility of selflessness because it's never been experienced, not by the conscious being anyway. So there's always been there, and I mean, I've used these metaphors often, haven't I? That it's like, having an over-tight shoe and it's uncomfortable, but you don't notice the discomfort because it's always been like that, so that just seems like that's natural. However, if that shoe was to suddenly be taken off you, it would be like, oh, what a sense of relief. Or an over-tight corset, if that's suddenly taken off you, it's like, there's literally an increase in a sort of sense of physical freedom, because now you can breathe more fully. So it's like that. We don't notice it because it's always been there. I could almost say it's kind of like exhausting, it wears us out, but we don't notice it because it's always been there. But when it goes, bang, what a revelation.
Is there any point in asking why it is there in the first place?
There's no point really in asking any why question, because the problem with a why, or we could say there's lots of point, but the problem with a why question is it can only be answered with a story. And it is quite obvious that in the apparent history of humanity, many, many, many people have asked that why question in different ways. You know, why is there separation? Or why are we cut off from God? Or why are we not already Buddhas? Whatever way you want to put it. And it's equally obvious that the mind has come up with 1,000 stories to answer that question, 10,000 stories to answer that question. So the story that the mind has come up with in the form of Judeo-Christianity is very different to the story that the mind has come up with in the form of this kind of Tibetan Buddhism. But actually that story in this kind of Tibetan Buddhism is different to that story in the other kind of Tibetan Buddhism, and so it goes on and on. I mean, so the mind is endlessly generating stories as to why it is that we seem separate, or cut off from God, or not yet Buddhas, or cut off from the love of the sweet Lord, whatever, however you want to put it. So that's the problem with the why question.
Understood, but not talking about mind things or religious things, but if we stay with the contracted energy idea, why does that have to happen? I mean, it's a stupid question, but I mean, it does happen, I understand that, but why does it contract down? Is it something to do with self-consciousness, becoming conscious of oneself at a certain point?
I mean, it's certainly not a stupid question, and we are faced, even when we ask it on that level and sort of try and take it away from the obvious kind of mind choice, we're still left with this problem that we can only answer it by coming up with a story. Now, it's possible, I am entirely open to this possibility. There's quite interesting research going on in the field of neuroscience and so on. It's possible that it has an evolutionary value. Maybe, perhaps, but because the point is it doesn't always arise. You know, there are rare cases where it doesn't arise. And these rare cases, when they are discovered by enthusiastic members of the rest of humanity, are often set up as on pedestals as great spiritual teachers or gurus or semi-gods, or simply we admire them and want to be around them. So there are examples like this, and I mean, I often I often refer, it seems to me, though I can't be sure, that J.J. Krishnamurti would be such an example from descriptions given of him when he was found as quite a young child, you know, and they, oh, we've got the world master here, we've got the next Maitreya here, how lovely. He's quite a young child. It sort of sounds like the sense of self had never really developed in him. I have met people, individuals, very occasionally, but I have met them, we're talking to them, I'd say the same thing. It sounds like this separate sense of self never really fully developed in them. Now, one of the things that you might say about Krishnamurti, and I would say about a few individuals I've met like that, they to an astonishing degree lack ambition, because there's nothing driving them. You know, I mean, what was Krishnamurti doing when he was discovered by the, the Anipescent Society, the Theosophists or whatever, walking around on a beach, wandering about, not doing very much. Now, I've spoken to people, that I know who sort of give similar reports of their childhood. Not many, but a few. So maybe it has an evolutionary function. you know, that sense of self. It provides a drive for the organism to go out there and do what organisms are supposed to do from an evolutionary point of view, which is procreate. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah. So then moving to the second question, if there is a recognition that this is contracted energy, the logical thing would say there must be a way to release this contracted energy.
We haven't found it yet. Maybe the new neuroscience will get us there. Maybe there will be in 50 years' time or even 10 years' time an enlightenment machine. You can go in and the neuroscientists can program, you know, maybe little scalpels to go, I don't know, you know. I mean, in principle, why not? In practice, I doubt it, but in principle, why not? You know, but, you know, we're at sea, but the mind doesn't like being at sea, so the mind has determined that there are countless paths for dealing with the pain of separation in a kind of ultimate way rather than in a kind of everyday way. I mean, the mind has come up with countless paths.
So would this be on the progressive path, the reason for meditation and stuff like that, and going to see gurus?
Yeah.
This is supposed to be releasing
Yeah.
the contracted energy.
Yeah, yeah. Getting rid of samskaras and that kind of thing. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say two things about that. The first thing would be, yeah, this is a lovely and very convincing story for the mind, of course. I mean, that documentary I referred to earlier on Netflix, Holy Hell, is precisely about that, this sort of very plausible and very charming and rather beautiful young man called Michel, who gathers these people around him in America, of course, you know, because this is exactly what he can do. He can confer upon them. I don't think he actually uses the word God consciousness, but he gets pretty close to it. But he can confer upon them, you know, an experience of knowing God and oneness and of course, it's the most lovely, seductive idea that can happen. But the other thing, of course, is that some of these experiences and paths and practices can have a genuine therapeutic value for the individual. You know. So I mean, I practiced meditation for 30 years. I would say meditation has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. Do I regret that? Of course. Well, I mean, apart from the fact that that 30 years never actually happened, but if we kind of pretend for a moment that it did, and there is the pretense of the fact that it happened in there, there's quite a few juicy stories about my guru in that book. Do I regret it on that everyday level on which a normal people, as opposed to us, might have a conversation? Well, no, because it had considerable therapeutic benefits, I would say. I'm not so convinced of, well no, I'll just stick with that. You know, I'm not so convinced that all of the kind of spiritual techniques and seeking techniques have therapeutic benefits, but I certainly think some of them do. Yeah. But therapeutic benefits are therapeutic benefits. They are benefits for the person.
Would it be too simplistic to say that when we talked about this contracted energy, that it's really sort of very closely tied in with the conditioning that the psychophysical organism experiences from a young age, where it's reinforced that you are a separate self?
I don't know.
And hence that contraction is over, well, I know about time.
I think it's deeper than that. I suspect it's deeper than that it's not really... I think it kind of kicks in before the conditioning has really had time to take much effect. It kicks in at a very early age, before there's much cognitive ability developed, I would say. I'd say other things, you could say, yeah, they are kind of cultural conditions. So, for example, somebody had the temerity, I believe, just before tea, to mention that terrible phrase, free will. Free will and choice. I mean, that, I think, you know, our conceptions of free will, our beliefs about it, our feeling about it, are hugely conditioned, and particularly conditioned by Judeo-Christianity, but also, to a certain extent, by other religious and spiritual stories as well. And I suspect that there are cultures, and that there certainly have been cultures in the past, where free will was not the huge, bloody great issue that it is for us. I was just assumed that, kind of, even say it was assumed that there was no such thing as going too far. It just wouldn't have even crossed the consciousness of certain cultures. So I think there's a lot of conditioning about things like that. Good and evil, you see, there's another one. I mean, good and evil is not a natural concept, it's a concept conditioned into us by Judeo-Christianity. There's quite an interesting debate recently between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. You know, Jordan Peterson obviously believes in Judeo-Christian good and evil, and Sam Harris is sort of pushing the Buddhist line, where it's not about good and evil, it's about ignorance. You know, what we call evil is a manifestation of what in Buddhism would be called ignorance. So that is conditioned, depends on the culture you're brought up in. But this contraction, it seems to be pretty universal across cultures, although not necessarily in all individuals, as I mentioned. You know, there are rare individuals where it either doesn't arise at all, or maybe it doesn't arise fully. And I mean, one of the things I certainly know from having spoken to a lot of people is the kind of opening to the possibility of the non-existence of the self without the full seeing of that does often happen in childhood. And don't ask me why, but it seems, you know, like pre-puberty, you come across a lot of people who, like, you know, when they hear this, they recognise it, and what they're recognising is a glimpse that they had in childhood.
So what, before the sense of a me fully developed?
I don't know why it should be, you know, a prepubescent self sense of the non-existence of the self, which is kind of partially but not fully apprehended. That is fairly common. It's fairly common.
Of course, if these prepubescent individuals went to a psychiatrist,
God help
and talked about that, then they would probably diagnose them with a personality disorder.
And may well have done, and who knows how many young people have unfortunately fallen into the hands. Yeah, in the same way that if you talk about this to somebody who doesn't understand it, they might look at you and start diagnosing disassociation or something like that. You know, and it's this classic thing, isn't it, that you need, you know, you need to be very careful what you say about this to a psychotherapist. If they understand this is great, that's absolutely great, but if they don't, you know, it's very difficult. And the classic case of that people know about is Susan Siegel, who seems to have gone through a whole raft of psychotherapists who had no idea what was going on for her and just kind of thought she was psychotic. Yeah.
I have a friend who cannot vouch for the veracity of his story, but it's quite a nice story. When she was about 10 or 11, he used to play this game of pretending to be Jane. So she had this memory, I mean, she's quite a sort of strange person, but she had this memory of being the self, as it were. But she would play this game of being Jane, a person, and people would call to her and say, Jane, come down for something. But she would know it was just a game. And then one night, she could not get back, as it were, to the self. And she wept all night because she knew that something had gone that she could not recover. So I don't know, I mean, it's a nice story, but it's just, it's in relation to that contracted energy that you can play with this a bit, but at a certain point, it's probably gone.
Yeah. It's made me think. I also feel that having talked to and met people where, from their description, you know, the sense of self didn't fully form. And going back to this thing that maybe it's evolutionary, because they often will say that they felt very much like oddballs during their whole growing up in their teenage years and so forth, and you know, couldn't fulfil the usual expectations, didn't have the kind of ambitions they were expected to have, you know, maybe kind of spent their childhood and teenage years watching, rather bemused at everybody else running frantically about and thinking, well, what's all the fuss about? Why is everybody so dramatic about everything? I mean, I'm thinking of one person in particular who's described it in virtually those words to me. And I think what can happen then, because we've been talking here about the possibility, for example, of having an event or another event or whatever, I think what can happen is that if someone, the sort of their sense of self has never really fully formed in that way, they can find it very difficult growing up. And then if they come across this, you know, they go and see Tony or pick up a book or something like that, then it can just suddenly fall into place and nothing else needs to happen. You know, so it's like, that explains why I've always felt like an outsider all my life. And then it's all over. No other event, no event in fact whatsoever, you know, just a sudden recognition that this description fits, I'll just use this phrase, their experience of life. And then it's just all over for them. Yeah.
But if, for want of a better word, experiences happen in childhood, and then the child is in the midst of conditioning or family culture or what have you, could that explain later mental health issues?
Oh yeah, I'm sure, absolutely, because basically you're on a kind of, I can't think of a metaphor that's going to work, so I'll just use this one. Basically you're on a different track to everybody else. Well, it depends how everybody else treats you, doesn't it? I mean, if they're understanding, if they're okay with the fact that this person is not fulfilling maybe any of the usual expectations in terms of ambition, life plan, life drive, all of that possibly evolutionary stuff that I'm saying maybe a sense of self gives us, who knows, you know, if the people around them are respecting that, it's probably great. But what are the chances of that? They go to a state school and etc., etc. Oh, pretty damn low, probably. So if the people around them are not respecting that, as they probably are not, then it's very difficult. And I've talked to people who felt like that. And which is why it can be such a relief then, you know, to come across this, and come across these ideas which have never been discussed or not available to read or anything to them when they were growing up, and then to suddenly come across this and go, right, okay, that's what's wrong with me. What's wrong with me is that there's nothing wrong with me. Yeah, that can be a profound relief. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose the tendency may be that if it's seen at an early age, and then maybe the assumption that, oh well, you know, other people will see it in a similar way, and then understanding that they don't if you start to speak about it, and then this sense of, oh well, then having to sort of shoehorn yourself into what is deemed to be acceptable within society, but knowing that something's not right, but you're going to tread that path because, well, that way you get, you know, less hassle.
They get referred to the child psychiatrist. So it's kind of similar to the stories you hear about young people who, I know it's not quite the same, but nevertheless similar ballpark. Young people who have, you know, sometimes very profound spiritual or transpersonal experiences, which are real on a level, and try and share those, and then very quickly learn to shut up. referred to the child psychologist. Yeah. Yeah.
This sort of contracted energy thing, I think, is interesting because I presume it's sort of working on a mental and physical contraction energy. Is that what you
Yeah, I mean, I might
made?
sit here and deny the distinction between them. Let's just call it psychophysical.
Physical.
It's one thing. It's
Yeah.
not. It's one
Because I
it's a
suppose
manifestation of the same energy. So.
because that contraction is very persuasive, isn't it? While there's a body,
Yeah.
you know, because you, on one sense, you could come across this and think, well, I've got a really clear understanding that there is no self.
Yeah.
That the idea of a separate person is an illusion. But yet, the sort of having a physical body with a contracted energy, it's very persuasive that there's still a sense of someone who's walked into a room,
Yeah.
sat on a chair,
Yeah.
or will get on the train and
Yeah.
go back home. You know, this
Yeah.
while that psychophysical organism or that contraction's there, it's
Yeah.
the sense of being someone,
Yeah.
something is very
And the
persuasive.
disappearance of that is very persuasive.
Mm.
When that disappears, it's very persuasive that, oh my God, that never existed.
Mm.
And even when, you know, I make this distinction between the sense of contraction and the sense of location, and both can disappear, but even if the sense of location comes back, as it almost certainly will and almost always does, you know, it's like everything's changed. I mean, when I say it's very persuasive when that disappears, it's very persuasive because it's like, okay, suddenly reality has been seen for the first time as it is. If insofar as the word reality means anything, it doesn't mean a lot, but it does mean something. So it is a kind of, oh my God moment, it may be. You know. And then that kind of recognition of why it is that this psychophysical organism could never have done anything to make that happen. You know? The illusion could never get rid of itself. The sense of I is an illusion, and the illusion can never get rid of itself.
I think there's terrific frustration about it because in life generally, one's understanding of a problem will usually assist in whatever, you know, resolving the problem or whatever. In this, it doesn't matter how long you've been studying it, how long you've been reading about it, how long you've been going to groups, whatever. All you have at the end of it is someone who has a very clear understanding of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, with total clarity about it, but it's still linked to a someone.
Yeah.
Or contracted energy, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's
No.
no way out. Is there?
Grossly unfair, and then you read about some bloody little swine like Krishnamurti, who just, you know, there was just no one when he was 8 years old. You know, how unfair is that? Well, of course, it's not unfair because it's explained by his karma from his 15 previous lives, which I have to say, Philip, the evidence is telling me were much more holy and spiritual than your lives. Yeah, I mean, spin whatever story you want to out of that. No, you're quite right. It is utterly unfair and unjust, and it's why. I mean, most of the people in the room probably noticed that there is a great deal of fractiousness and heat and argument generated around what is said about this, just as there is about any other philosophical, spiritual, or religious or transcendental matter. I mean, so far, we haven't had a holy war over whether the transubstantiation of the host is real or metaphorical yet.
Yes.
You know, we haven't had sort of 1500 years of slaughter over that one yet, like the Christians have, but we've got pretty close at times. Because partly it's such an affront to the mind. What you're saying is such an affront to the mind. It just seems so grotesquely unreasonable and unfair. You know, so you could say, you know, the non-duality version of, you know, does the host literally transubstantiate into the blood and the flesh, as the Catholics say, or is it a metaphor, as the Protestants say? You could say our dearly beloved religion's version of that is path or no path. You know, and, you know, eventually we probably will have a crusade about that. We'll have martyrs, we'll have no path martyrs. It is, it's grotesquely unfair, but notice it's grotesquely unfair to the mind. And the mind is just irrelevant here.
What did you say, path or no path? What is that?
Path or no path.
Path!
Yeah. Yeah. So the mind desperately wants to believe there is something it can do to bring about that which is most longed for, merging with the beloved. And so because the mind of the seeker desperately yearns for that, the mind of the teacher will arise to bestow that upon them. Of course, yeah.
But finally the me is also that.
Is also
That, what we are talking about.
yes, absolutely, fine, of course. Yeah,
So
yeah.
for
It's all a
example-
big game in a way, yeah.
So for example in self-inquiry meditation there is exploring of this original sense of I am.
Yeah,
Because this is the closest feeling, sense of it. So they explore it until it's like
Until it's gone.
resolve by
Yeah.
itself or something.
that's the theory, yeah. So it's the mind trying to self-destruct the mind, and one of the problems about that is that the mind that's trying to do that doesn't actually exist. You know, the mind is just a series of thoughts, perceptions, feelings, and so forth. But, you know, again, it doesn't matter if we... Hopefully, maybe we will be able to avoid the crusade over this if we remember that unlike those who believe in the transubstantiation of the host, it may be possible for us to remember, and it doesn't matter, you know, if we're drawn to self-inquiry, then probably self-inquiry will happen. If we're not drawn to it, then probably it won't happen. And in either case, liberation may or may not be seen. You know, so, you know, we can come back to whatever happens, happens, and hopefully it's more difficult to build a holy war on whatever happens, happens. You know. There's nothing wrong with self-inquiry. There's nothing right with self-inquiry. There's nothing wrong with not self-inquiry, etc., etc. But if it happens, it happens. And one of the things is if even if it's just the mind that really gets that, then it's possible that some relaxation can take place. And as I have quoted over and over again, but I think this afternoon it was only in the tea break talking to you that I quoted it, as I've quoted over and over again, relaxation is the key to Buddhahood right now. You know, that's not the words, you know, those aren't the words I'd have chosen. It's a Buddhist who's giving those words, obviously, but they're pretty damn good. Relaxation is the key to Buddhahood, right here and now, which is why I think I was saying earlier, why I often find myself saying that, you know, despair, it's not really, it's not all that, it's not that bad. Don't run away from despair, because in despair, relaxation may arise. In hope, relaxation is less likely to arise. So you could say, we're more likely to achieve Buddhahood, if we want to think in those terms, we're more likely to achieve Buddhahood from despair than from hope. Now the mind has just invented a new path, the path of despair. Well, the mind's going to do that. It can't help it. Doesn't matter.
You mean it's
The mind is a monkey.
closer to giving up, so this despair closer to giving up
Yeah.
than hope.
And therefore more relaxing.
Yeah.
Because as long as there's hope, there's always something we
Yeah.
can do, which is not very relaxing. Yeah. 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 And after all, I mean, what people say, and I think it's a perfectly justifiable question, although it's unanswerable, what's it like? Well, it's not possible to say what it's like, but you could say, well, it is at least a little bit relaxing. At the very least.
The other thing that came across from Tony's book, it's funny when you read books, if you read them a few years later, it's as though you've never read them before. It's quite extraordinary. And he talks about awareness. Now, I went through school that was sort of into self-remembering and the Gurdjieff Uspensky idea of, you know, remembering oneself, being aware of oneself. And Tony talks about how awareness is actually a duality, because there's me being aware of something. And there's this horrible realization that everything you try and do, in inverted commas, to assist this process of removing the contraction, actually only strengthens it, because you're actually strengthening the me. There's me being aware, or me being conscious, or me meditating, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. But there's nothing you can do.
No, it's not about this. No.
But if there's a sense of a me, and then there's awareness, it's the me that takes ownership of the awareness. Like, I'm aware of my thoughts, I'm aware of my feelings, I'm aware of sensations, whatever. But when the person drops away, I presume, there's obviously still awareness, because there's an awareness of a question being asked. You know, there's aware of the siren in the street, but it's just not me that's aware. It's just awareness.
It's just happening,
I would say that.
You see, I'd say that some techniques, like I knew somebody years ago who did this self-remembering technique, and it was a very strange experience, because I think I've written that, I mentioned him in a couple of my, because he'd come to the door, you know, he'd drop round, and I'd say, oh, hello Jeff, how are you? And there'd be this pause while he remembered who he really was. And then he'd say, oh, I'm fine, really. Oh, do you want a cup of tea, Jeff? And he'd pause while he remembered who he really was again, before he'd say, yeah, can I have one sugar with that? It's really bizarre, talking to him. But I think some techniques, particularly when they're around manipulating or controlling the mind or changing the way the mind deals with reality in that way, I'd say, you know, quite iffy, you know, and they can sort of produce a kind of detachment from the world, which is kind of anti-therapeutic in a way. I'd say other methods are much more innocent, and I think, you know, there are forms of meditation which are very innocent and don't try and control the mind in any way. They can genuinely be therapeutic. Therapeutic, but they're working on that level, I would say.
Because that detachment thing, that was another big thing we used to have. Because, you know, you are the observer. You are not that which you observe. You are the observer, standing back, observing. Well, that's just another dualistic concept. You know, you are, there's nothing, there is no one that's looking at anything. It's just seeing, just tasting, whatever.
And I think there are probably gender differences here. I'm not going to get into trouble here. But I would say, that kind of, so, you know, the men are practicing detachment and the women are practicing ecstatic dance. Kind of, in a way. I know which I'd rather be doing, and it wouldn't be any detachment. Well, there's kind of paths of bhakti, and there are paths of knowledge and so forth, and ultimately they will collapse. There are no paths because there's no place to start from and no place to reach. It's just this.
And what is the purpose of this self-remembering process? You know, your friend Jeff, you know.
You talk about it, but you're much more
there-
au fait with it than I
What's the
am.
Well,
rationale behind
it was all in Gurdjieff and Spencer. I don't know if you ever read it.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I mean, it was, the idea was that you remember yourself, but you cannot remember yourself. It's an impossibility. So, and finally, I think even Ouspensky realised there was something missing from that tradition.
And when they talk about the self-remembering, they talk about the self, or they talk about the non-separate self, in that sense? Or
I think the idea is it's the big self remembering itself, but actually it can't be.
yes.
It's like becoming aware of awareness, becoming conscious of consciousness. So, they weasel, I mean, words like awareness and consciousness, I think there are certain ways, certain things talking about kind of human perceptions of it. It's very difficult to avoid those words, but they are weasel words because they do suggest that there is something separate called consciousness. Well, there isn't. It's just this. You know, there's not this and consciousness. There is not this arising in consciousness. I often use the phrase myself, you know, this is arising in oneness, because we have to say something, but there's not this, there's not oneness separate, and then this arising in it. There isn't the cinema screen, and separate from the cinema screen, an image arising on it. You know, so awareness and consciousness are very difficult. You could say there's just experience. I mean, when I say all there is this, then sometimes I add, you know, what does this consist of? Phenomena. All there is phenomena. What's that? Experience. Everything's an experience. It's not consciousness in which experience arises. Experience contains within it, if you like, everything about consciousness you need, because otherwise it wouldn't be experience. And the problem with these words and the ideas they set off is then they give rise to whole schools, spiritual schools and philosophical schools. Because if there's something called awareness, then there's probably something better than that called pure awareness. So I can purify my awareness until it becomes pure. If there's something called consciousness, there's probably something called a higher level of consciousness. Well, maybe there's 30 of those. And I have been on a website recently, I have to say only for about a minute, just to confirm how mad it was, where I think they have 1,000 levels of consciousness, which you can pay money to do workshops to work your way through if you want to. You know, so the problem with these words, you know, they kind of generate a false idea, which then a whole big story and schools of philosophy and spiritual growth can be built on. But there isn't. And obviously, well, it's kind of obvious we're conscious, isn't it? It's kind of obvious we're aware, using language in a very everyday way. But actually, we're not aware. What is obvious is that there is awareness of consciousness. No, what's obvious is that experience is happening. That's what's obvious. That's what's undeniable. Is it happening for me? Well, we could argue about that. We could write 15-volume philosophical treatises about that. Is this experience happening for me? Well, forget about that. What's obvious is there's experience. This is happening. And what's equally obvious in a way, although the mind denies it, or might deny it, is what is so often said. Not only this is happening, but this is all that's happening. This is all there is. Now the mind could then get into a great philosophical debate about Africa, forget it. Mind's never going to get anywhere with that. Forget it. This is what's happening. That's incontrovertible. There is nothing but this. What is this? Whatever's happening.
So, and also the sense of a me and the sense of a separate self is also what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as I've said many times, you see, what can't be seen in separation is that the sense of me, the sense of separation is, I'm going to put the word just in, just another phenomenon. But it seems to be the phenomenon that all the other ones attach to. So the sound of a voice is happening. You know, the vision of a hand moving around is happening. You know, a hand moves there. The colour of a jumper there. The feeling of a bum upon a seat here. All of these are phenomena happening. The sense of self, another phenomena happening. Or the sense of contraction, however you want to put it, just another phenomenon. And it seems to be key, because it seems like all those other phenomena, like the sound of a voice, is being heard or sensed by the sense of me, by me. So that seems to be central, but it's not, it's just another thing that's happening. It's not happening all the time anyway, not for anybody. I mean, not the most rigidly self-centered person in the world, whatever the hell that phrase means, and I know it's ambiguous. Not even for them. Even for them there will be times when there is no sense of self. It's just other stuff happening.
But why does that description that you've just given, when you add "and it's enough," why does that sound rather prosaic? You know, that it's just the hand moving or the colour of the shadow. Why does that, to me, sound as though, well, that's a bit boring.
Yeah.
It's not really enough. I want whistles and bells.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, you've answered your question. You've answered your own question in terms of the question, because you said, why does it not seem enough to me? It's precisely because it's to you, it doesn't seem enough to the separated person. When the separated person isn't there, it is enough, which is why life often becomes much simpler then, because there's less impulse to do exciting things to keep myself away from boredom. What we were talking about in the tea break, that when this is even if it's just glimpsed, life tends to become much simpler. The desire to have complex, exciting things happen in life tends, not always, but tends to collapse. Because it's me that feels bored, it's me that doesn't feel this is enough. I mean, I could say, if you want excitement in drama in your life, then run away from non-duality as fast as you can. I mean, I know that's an absurd thing to say because you can't, but, you know, you get the point, you know. I mean, how many times has Tony said this ruins your life? Well, it does. It also reveals that you don't have a life to be ruined. But obviously, advice on any matter to do with this is utterly absurd, but if we pretend for the moment it isn't, the advice might be do everything you want to do in your life first before you stumble on non-duality. Make your bucket list and make sure that you have ticked everything off on it before you come across non-duality, because when you come across non-duality you may well junk your bucket list. To the great disappointment of your partner, who was expecting to go on a 6 months world cruise with you.
sort of like a list of, you know, pros and cons, you know, non-duality, you know.
Yeah.
When the person drops away, you know, oh yeah, those are the plus things, or those.
You can see bright colours.
And calm them. Calm how many
Yeah, feeling more relaxed, yeah. But feeling more relaxed, but then, oh yeah, my life is ruined.
I think the cons would outweigh the pros, actually.
But this is, of course, what the mind would love. I mean, the mind loves schemes.
Yeah.
They can understand schemes. It's in control of the scheme. Of course, a plan. That's what we need. We need a plan, because as long as there's a plan, then the mind's in control. Yeah. So homework is definitely, you know, make that bucket list and make sure you tick off one thing, at least one thing a month.
Coming to non-duality meetings might be part
It
of
could well be, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Staying away from
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's the only thing on the bucket list.
Make that bucket list before the tiger seizes you in its mouth.
But of course we don't have a choice of whether that happens or not.
I know. It's hopeless. That is the mantra, isn't it? We don't have a mantra, but if we did, just remembering the kind of the first mantra we had in the early days, hopeless, helpless and meaningless.
It's not much of a crowd pull.
Well, obviously not. I don't think you were even here 2 months ago, and it was an even smaller crowd. Yeah, but nevertheless, you see again, probably understood, we could maybe see why that could provoke more relaxation if it's really got, it is hopeless, I am helpless, it is meaningless.
Could be the new John Lewis slogan.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're doing very well at the moment. So
Yes,
it's
or
the mission statement.
or House of Fraser, or any major business at the moment. Yeah. I wonder whether some of these people who've been wandering past in the afternoon occasionally catch a phrase through the window. What the bloody hell is going on in there? Is this some kind of suicide? Kind of, in a way, it is, aren't we? I mean, again, going back to Tony, you know, I am not original in saying this. In a way, we come to non-duality meetings to commit suicide. But this is the suicide after which it is still possible to eat cake and drink tea.
It also can get you before you ticked all the boxes, and then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there are no boxes to tick really, of course not. Yeah, if there were, we could have a plan. And if we could have a plan, the mind could at last be satisfied. Yeah. Meditate for longer each day. Spend more time with the Guru. Eat lentils and greens and brown rice only. Well, at least we're not in the Guru cult in holy hell. They all had to learn ballet. They learn ballet, they had to practice ballet for hours and hours a day. That's one of their spiritual practices, because Michelle, this plausible narcissistic psychopath who is the Guru, happened to have been a ballet dancer and loved it. They were all practicing their pliés for hours every day as a spiritual practice. I recommend it.
Yeah.
One of the prescribed paths to enlightenment
Yeah.
is through ballet.
Yeah, pas de deux. I think on that note, we shall bring the afternoon to an end. So thank you for being here. Thank you.